Kate, today's a really special day because today the Paris Agreement comes into effect. Tell us what you think about that. How does that affect Australians and how important is it?
I think we can say of Paris that there was a serious meeting of the minds about the extraordinary challenges we have to meet in this climate change age, and we've committed to implementation. So many agreements are about what we would like to see by way of protocols. They're not always about process or practice. This one is about implementation. And anybody who heard the radio this morning would of course know that if we haven't acted to address and in effect arrest our emissions by 2020, we are almost certainly locking ourselves into a 3-degree 2100 or 2100. That's going to be not just challenging but deeply, deeply disturbing, not just for us but for people all over the world. And we know that there's an equity issue underpinning this. So the people who are the most vulnerable now will be the people who have to deal with those challenges in ways that they are simply not equipped to do. And that raises for me, and I think should for our governments, many questions about how responsible as a wealthy nation we should be. We are responsible for our emissions. We can do something about it. We've got a wonderful history of engineering in this country. We built the Snowy system. We can do these things, and implementation for us is both a challenge and an opportunity, and Paris presents us with that. It's extraordinarily important that we do our bit.
And what has Australia actually committed to?
Look, we've committed to keeping our emissions to a level that would see us at 1.5 or 2 degrees. We've all done that across the world. We've committed to taking action that sees us running competent agricultural systems, running cities that are livable, maintaining an environment for our grandchildren and our children in some instances. So we've made this commitment to keep our emissions down, and in simple terms, by doing so, make what we know we are going to have to deal with capable of being dealt with. It's a simple thing, in a way, to make or to assert a target. The difficult thing is for all of us to club together, cooperate, collaborate, and make sure that we meet them. And that's where leadership is so important.
So Kate, just on that point, what sorts of things are you seeing other government entities doing, and what sorts of things are the private sector people doing to reduce emissions?
In government, we're seeing subnational governments do wonderfully well, in my view. There are still challenges. Only today we heard New South Wales has said that it wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. They will need to not open new coal mines, and they will need to do something about land clearing or tree clearing. We've seen the ACT government really lead in this regard, where there's commitments to zero carbon and there's commitment to 100% renewables by 2040. We've seen the ACT government pick up and run with renewables by way of wind and solar. We've seen the Victorian government come on board in respect of those sorts of challenges and targets as well. Business is very interesting. Business was in Paris saying, we know we need to do well. We know if we don't, we won't have businesses. And we've seen that happening in a really diverse range of enterprises, from people like Nike to people like water boards to people like the electric vehicle manufacturers. And we're going to see that increasingly happen with business. Now, business will lead when they're given the incentives, and they'll lead when their shareholders tell them that it's important they do it. And they will also lead when their CEOs and boards recognise these are grave issues, urgent matters that require action now.
Just on that point, Kate, we've recently seen that directors can be held accountable now if they don't take into account the need for action on climate change. Do you think that will spur organisations on to greater efforts?
I'm sure it will. I'm sure that directors are very well aware of their obligations and have been for some years now aware of the personal responsibilities that go with infractions. They're very well advised for the most part by their legal counsel. They're very well advised by their craft and other organisational structures. The Australian Institute of Company Directors will be instilling these messages in everybody who goes through their courses, for instance. Businesses are in the business of the future, and those who take their CEO and board responsibilities seriously will be thinking not just of the money opportunities but of legacy. And big business is quite interesting in this regard. We've watched over time big business think about its environmental management systems and maybe not climate change. We're seeing a shift. We're seeing corporate social responsibility become much more inculcated in the way in which businesses try to address issues of ethics, of equity, and now of climate change.
So our board and our executive team has been having a conversation around that just recently, and our organisation is committed to taking action. We have a responsibility to take action. We now have some targets that are being set by state government that we need to achieve. What sorts of things would you think that North East Water could be pursuing in this area to reduce our carbon emissions?
Water is life for this country. We know we need to use water. We also know that we will be exposed to extreme events in respect of water, and we've just recently had some pretty extreme floods go through here, which followed on from the drought that we thought we were settling into as a result of the weather patterns. If we're not thinking about how we manage water at the board level, we're not going to be capable of addressing those issues, which are the extreme events that are going to be upon us. We need both adaptation and mitigation strategies. We need the adaptation plans to not just be a compilation of what we did in the past, but it needs to reflect, or a plan needs to reflect, those very serious eventualities that are going to flow with climate change realities. We need to be thinking about how we mitigate our carbon footprint, and that will be doing everything from changing our fleet patterns, changing our flight patterns, changing the way our offices operate, thinking about our energy, water and waste. And those are prosaic matters for the most part, and we often think that they're simple and they don't have an impact. They do, because what flows from that, to use that water metaphor again, is that information flows into the community and inspires the community, informs the community and draws them into the conversation. And we saw some wonderful work happening with water boards about the last big drought, the Millennium Drought, when people in water boards really sought out ways to conserve water and plan for an ongoing drought. Water boards will need to do that. Every board, such as your board, has a chance now to seriously engage with the public and advise the public of the science and the realities, cultivate in the public a real concern about how we deal with these matters as a community, and listen to the community about the things they already know and about what they want to see by way of leadership from those organisations.
One of the debates that we know that's still going on in our region, for example, is around the difference between importance and urgency. Is climate change really that important, and just how urgent is it that we take action?
I really pause when I think about answering a question such as that, because there's no doubt that climate change is the challenge of this century. And it's not just for us in what some might describe as our reasonably comfortable Australian lives. Everything we do in response to climate change, mitigation and adaptation planning, has an impact beyond our front fence. If we're not thinking of ourselves as global citizens, we're not being our best selves. That's my personal view. It's extraordinarily urgent we deal with climate change as global citizens, as responsible citizens, as people concerned about the legacy for our children and grandchildren. It's also important that we take with us those people who may not see the science in the way that we do by engaging them through government with the sorts of activities that government can encourage by regulation, by incentives, and by encouragement broadly through organisational structures. If we don't act on climate change now, we will be looking at a 3 to 4 degree increase in temperatures by the end of this century. That, in a country such as ours, is going to present us with uninhabitable places where we think we can live now. It's going to be far worse for those extraordinarily vulnerable people around the world. And it troubles me that anyone who reads the material that's out there now about those exposed knows that it is women and children who are the most exposed. Climate change is going to kill people. It's going to devastate biodiversity. It's going to make it impossible for species to survive. And as that occurs, we will be stripped of what we now value, which is our capacity to enjoy nature and enjoy ecosystem services, which is the things like clean air, fresh water, soil that's productive. We will make this continent uninhabitable, and we will make the world uninhabitable. It's gross, but in my view, it's as simple as that. 2100, if we don't act, is going to be a very unpleasant place to be.
So, Kate, you're seeing that climate change is giving us a deep responsibility, a moral responsibility, dare I say, a legal responsibility now through the laws that are being passed and the statutory expectations that governments are putting on communities and certainly the public sector. But there's also a great opportunity, isn't there? And that's one of the really positive things that I suppose we can grasp at this time in thinking of the future about how we can each make a commitment and drive our own little piece of the puzzle. So what would you say to the staff of North East Water?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because any time you talk about the ugliness of what we might be confronting, it can crush people. I'm personally of the view that humanity is better than that. And if I was talking to your team, I'd say what we say here to ourselves and we've said all over the state whenever we've talked about these really big challenges. Start where you are, because you know the place that you live in and you work in and you know your community. So start where you are. Start where you are because you care about those things as well, and that makes you intensely interested in the outcomes. The next thing we say here to ourselves is then organise. And by that I mean make sure that you're bringing people along with you. It's not a lonely journey, this. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, and it won't be if we're successful. And having said start where you are and organise, I think it's important to show what you've done. And that's the big science communication conundrum and question. We've been very bad at communicating the science, so we need to take or shoulder some of the responsibility for that. In fact, quite a bit of the responsibility. We need to be better at it in organisations such as mine and yours. But when people do succeed, personally or collectively amongst themselves, it's so important to show that to others, to demonstrate how these things are done. And also to tell people that it won't be a seamless journey. There'll be steps forward and steps back. There'll be periods of recovery. There'll be periods of despair, probably, for some of us. But there'll be enormous joy when we know that people have embarked on doing something about this.
Recently at North East Water, we've been talking about renewable energy and some projects that we're might hopefully be involved in. We're certainly interested in working with the Totally Renewable Yakandanda group. We're talking about a project out there. And we're also talking about the possibility of some really major projects. We've also had some conversations with some of our industrial customers, the really big players in the region, about potential partnerships that we might have with them on some major projects. And then there's also the aspect of all the additional infrastructure that we need to put in place to make sure that we're ready for when those significant changes occur. So all of those things are exciting in one way, but they also come at a cost, and that cost will eventually be borne by our customers. How do we reconcile that for our customers? What do you see as the logic behind that?
For some customers, it will never be seen as having a logic to it, because some people really are going to struggle with the costs associated. I think it's a responsibility of the organisation that you're involved, your organisation and your customers, to have a really engaged discussion about this. It also needs to be a discussion that takes the message up to the federal government, for instance, because this cannot be done just by organisations and their customers. There will be some very serious and very significant costs attendant on what we need to do now. But every economist who talks about these issues tells me, and anyone who listens, that if we don't do it now, it will cost a great deal more when we decide to actually get active. Organisations are good at planning. They're also good in the water sector at engineering in respect of planning. So you have the skills, you have the ability, and now it's a question of the commitment to the conversation to persuade everybody of the absolute essential nature of the action being taken now. Otherwise, as I say, we'll all be paying a great deal more down the track if it's not ultimately just too late to do anything.